The transport truck rumbled through the main gate of Fort Ashford just after dawn, its engine coughing diesel exhaust into the cool morning air. In the back, wedged between two other passengers and a stack of duffel bags, sat a woman who looked entirely unremarkable. Her dark hair was pulled into a regulation bun, her uniform crisp but standard issue, her face bare of makeup and expression. She watched the base unfold through the canvas, opening with eyes that missed nothing, though anyone glancing her way would have seen only another nervous recruit arriving for assignment. The truck lurched to a stop outside the reception building. Staff Sergeant Brock Halverson stood waiting, clipboard in hand, his weathered face already set in the particular expression of irritation that came from processing new arrivals. He was a 20-year veteran with salt and pepper hair buzzed close to his scalp and the kind of posture that spoke of decades spent standing at attention. As the passengers climbed down, he barely glanced at them, calling out names in a monotone that suggested this was the 1,000th time he had performed this exact ritual. Chun, report to Building 12. Morrison, Building 9. The woman stepped down last, her boots hitting the pavement with practiced precision. Halverson's eyes flicked to his clipboard, then to her, then back again. His mouth twitched into something that might have been amusement or disdain. Keller, he said, drawing out the name. You are reporting for temporary administrative duty while your permanent assignment processes. Building 6, second floor. She nodded once, reaching for a duffel. Halverson made no move to help, though he had offered to assist with Morrison's bags moments before. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the corporal standing beside him, a younger man named Garrett Finch whose eager expression suggested he was still new enough to find entertainment in the mundane. Fresh meat, Halverson muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Probably some clerk who could not hack it at her last posting. Finch snorted, not bothering to lower his voice. Yeah, she looks real intimidating. Wonder what strings got pulled to land her here. The woman they called Keller adjusted the duffel on her shoulder, her expression unchanged. She had heard every word, absorbed every inflection, noted the casual disrespect and the assumption of incompetence. Her fingers rested briefly against the strap of her bag, a gesture so subtle that no one watching would have recognized it as the kind of weight check that came from decades of carrying gear in combat zones. She said nothing, simply turned toward Building 6 and began walking. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have served at a military base in your area or know someone who has. The administrative office on the second floor of Building 6 smelled like old coffee and copy machine toner. 3 desks crowded the space, 2 of them occupied by specialists who glanced up briefly when Keller entered, then immediately returned to their work with the kind of dismissive disinterest that suggested she was beneath their notice. The 3rd desk sat empty, a computer monitor dark, a layer of dust visible on the keyboard. Specialist Raina Volkov, a woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, gestured vaguely toward the empty desk without looking up from her screen. That one is yours. Do not touch anything on our desks. Do not use our printer. Lieutenant Cardwell will be in at 0900 to give you your assignment list. Keller set her duffel beside the desk and sat down carefully, her posture perfect despite the uncomfortable chair. She made no attempt at conversation, simply observed the room with the same quiet attention she had given everything else since arriving. The other specialist, a man named Torres whose name tape was partially obscured by coffee stains, finally looked at her directly. So where did you transfer from? He asked, though his tone suggested he did not particularly care about the answer. Keller met his gaze steadily. Fort Benning, she said. Her voice was calm, unremarkable, giving nothing away. Torres exchanged a glance with Volkov. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Fort Benning, he repeated. What were you doing there? Filing paperwork for the infantry. Something like that, Keller replied. Volkov laughed, a short bark of sound. Well, welcome to Fort Ashford. Try not to screw anything up. We have a system here, and we do not need someone coming in and making things complicated. Keller nodded once, turning her attention to the dark computer screen. Her reflection looked back at her, distorted slightly in the curved glass. Behind her, Torres and Volkov had already dismissed her from their thoughts, returning to their work with the confidence of people who believe they had taken the full measure of a person in 30 seconds and found nothing worth their time. Lieutenant Marcus Cardwell arrived at precisely 0900, his uniform immaculate, his stride confident in the way of officers who had never seen combat but had mastered the appearance of authority. He was 32, young for his rank, with the kind of smooth features and careful grooming that suggested he spent more time on his career trajectory than on the actual work of leadership. His eyes swept the office, pausing on Keller with an expression that managed to convey both curiosity and dismissal in a single glance. "You must be our temporary addition," he said, not bothering with introductions. Keller stood, her movements economical and precise. Cardwell did not offer his hand. "I have been told you are here for administrative support while your paperwork processes. I trust you have experience with basic office systems." "Yes, sir," Keller replied, her tone neutral. "Good. Volkov will show you the filing system. We have 3 months of backlogged supply requisitions that need to be entered into the database. It is tedious work, but someone has to do it." He glanced at his watch, a gesture that seemed calculated to communicate his own importance and limited time. "I have a meeting with the battalion executive officer. Try to stay out of everyone's way." He left without waiting for acknowledgement, his boots clicking against the tile floor with rhythmic precision. The moment the door closed behind him, Torres leaned back in his chair, grinning at Volkov. 3 months of supply requisitions. That ought to keep her busy and quiet. Volkov pulled a massive binder from beneath her desk, dropping it onto Keller's workspace with a thud that raised a small cloud of dust. "Everything in here needs to be entered by end of week. It is all self-explanatory if you have any brain cells. If you have questions, figure out yourself. We are busy with actual important work." Keller opened the binder, her expression unchanged as she surveyed hundreds of handwritten requisition forms, many of them barely legible, some with coffee stains or torn edges. The work was deliberately designed to be mind-numbing, the kind of task given to someone as punishment or to keep them occupied and irrelevant. She pulled the first stack toward her and began working, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a speed and precision that neither Torres nor Volkov noticed, absorbed as they were in their own screens. The morning crept forward. At 10:30, Staff Sergeant Halverson appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with the casual arrogance of someone who considered this office his personal domain despite having no official assignment there. He held a styrofoam cup of coffee, steam rising from a small opening in the lid. "How is our new recruit settling in?" he asked, directing the question to Volkov, but looking at Keller. "Oh, she's doing just fine," Volkov replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We gave her some nice simple data entry to help her adjust to the pace here at Ashford." Halverson smirked. "Data entry. Perfect. We would not want to overwhelm anyone with anything too challenging." He took a long sip of coffee, still watching Keller over the rim of his cup. "You know, Keller, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I can usually tell within the first hour whether someone is going to make it at a posting or washout. Want to know which category I think you fall into." Keller's fingers paused on the keyboard. She looked up, meeting Halverson's eyes with an expression of polite attention that revealed absolutely nothing. "I am sure you will tell me, Staff Sergeant," she said quietly. Halverson's smirk widened. "Smart girl. You are right, I will tell you. You have that look. The one that says you are just passing through, probably hoping to coast until retirement or until you can transfer somewhere easier. This is not a hard posting, but it is not a place for people who want to hide and do the minimum. We have standards here, even if they are sending us their reject from other bases." Torres laughed, a sound too loud for the small office. "Rejects from Benning. That is rich. What did you do there?" Keller organized the general's sock drawer. "Actually," Keller said, her voice still calm, "I worked in operational planning." Halverson nearly choked on his coffee. "Operational planning. Is that what they are calling it now?" He shook his head, pushing off from the doorframe. "Well, good luck with those requisitions. Try not to screw them up too badly. We have an inspection coming up in 2 weeks, and we need everything in order." The last thing we need is someone making us look bad because she cannot handle basic administrative work. He left, his laughter echoing down the hallway. Volkov and Torres exchanged knowing glances, their expressions united in shared amusement at the new arrival's expense. Keller returned her attention to the requisition forms, her face betraying nothing of the careful catalog she was building in her mind. Every dismissive comment, every casual cruelty, every violation of the basic respect that should exist between service members regardless of rank or assignment. She noted it all, filed it away with the same precision she applied to the data entry, each observation another piece of a larger picture that was beginning to take shape. The morning shift ended. Volkov and Torres gathered their belongings, barely acknowledging Keller's presence as they headed for the door. "Do not forget to lock up if you are the last one out," Volkov called over her shoulder. "And do not touch anything that is not yours." Keller waited until their footsteps faded down the stairwell. Then she turned back to her screen, her fingers moving with purpose across the keyboard, entering data with mechanical efficiency while her mind worked through everything she had observed. The supply requisitions told their own story, one of inefficiency and poor management, of corners cut and protocols ignored. It was all there in the paperwork, waiting for someone who knew how to read between the lines. The second day brought more of the same, but with an edge of escalation that suggested the novelty of having someone new to mock had not yet worn off. Keller arrived at 0700, finding the office already occupied by Volkov, who looked up with barely concealed irritation at the early arrival. "You do not need to be here until 0800, Volkov said, her tone sharp. "We do not get paid extra for showing up early and pretending to be motivated." Keller set her bag down quietly. "I wanted to make progress on the requisitions. There's quite a backlog." Volkov's eyes narrowed. "The backlog has been there for months. It will still be there at 0800. But sure, go ahead and try to make the rest of us look bad by being the overeager tryhard." The comment hung in the air, weighted with implications. Keller simply moved to her desk and powered on the computer, her movements unhurried. She had learned long ago that some battles were won by refusing to engage, by maintaining composure when others sought reaction. It was a lesson taught in far harsher classrooms than this one, in places where maintaining calm under pressure meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Torres arrived 20 minutes later with Cardwell close behind. The lieutenant carried a stack of manila folders which he dropped onto Keller's desk without preamble. "These are personnel evaluation reports that need filing," he said. "They are alphabetized, but not sorted by date. Get them organized properly and filed in the main records room by end of day." The records room is in Building 3, basement level. He walked away before she could acknowledge the order. Torres leaned over, glancing at the folders with a knowing smirk. "That records room is a disaster," he said conversationally. "Nobody has organized it properly in about 5 years. Have fun down there in the dungeon. Watch out for rats." Keller gathered the folders and stood. Torres watched her go, his expression suggesting he expected some kind of complaint or resistance. When none came, he turned back to Volkov with a shrug. "She is either incredibly stupid or incredibly patient," he muttered. "Maybe both," Volkov replied, not bothering to lower her voice. The basement of Building 3 smelled of mildew and old paper. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows across rows of filing cabinets that lined the narrow room. Torres had not been exaggerating about the disorganization. Files were jammed into drawers at random, some folders bent or torn, others bulging with loose papers that threatened to spill onto the concrete floor. A fine layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the tracks of someone's recent passage to the back corner where newer cabinets stood. Keller set the folders on a relatively clear section of floor and surveyed the space with the same methodical attention she had given everything else. The chaos was not random. It told a story of years of neglect, of junior personnel given tasks without proper training or supervision, of a command climate that prioritized appearance over substance. She could fix this, organize it properly, create a system that would last. But that was not her purpose here. Her purpose was to observe, to understand, to see how this base truly functioned when people thought no one important was watching. She began sorting the personnel files, creating stacks on the floor according to a logic that would make sense to anyone who needed to find specific documents later. 2 hours passed. The basement door opened and heavy footsteps descended the stairs. Staff Sergeant Halverson appeared, his bulk filling the narrow aisle between cabinets. Well, he said, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. Look at you down here in the dungeon, playing with old paperwork. This is probably the most excitement you have had in years. Keller looked up from her work. Is there something you need, Staff Sergeant? Halverson leaned against a filing cabinet, his weight causing it to creak ominously. I need to make sure you're not screwing up my record system. These files are important. They contain sensitive personnel information. I cannot have some temporary assignment clerk messing them up because she does not understand the filing protocol. The filing protocol, Keller said evenly, appears to be non-existent. Halverson's expression darkened. Excuse me? These files are not organized according to any standard system, Keller continued, her tone factual rather than accusatory. Dates are mixed. Alphabetization is inconsistent, and several folders contain documents that belong in different categories entirely. If there was a protocol, it has not been followed for quite some time. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Halverson pushed off from the cabinet, taking 2 steps closer. His face had gone red, a vein visible at his temple. Let me tell you something, Specialist Keller. I have been managing these records longer than you have probably been in the military. If you think you can waltz in here after 2 days and start criticizing how we do things, you are even more clueless than I thought. Your job is not to evaluate our systems. Your job is to do what you are told and keep your mouth shut while you do it. Keller held his gaze, her expression neutral. Yes, Staff Sergeant. Halverson stared at her for a long moment, as if waiting for some sign of fear or contrition. When none came, he shook his head slowly. You have got some nerve, I will give you that. But nerve does not mean much if you do not have the competence to back it up. Finish filing these reports and get back upstairs. And Keller? Next time you feel like sharing your opinions about how we run things here, remember that you are temporary. We will still be here long after you are gone. He climbed the stairs without waiting for a response. Keller listened to his footsteps fade, then returned to her work. Her hands moved efficiently through the folders, but her mind was cataloging something far more significant than misfiled paperwork. She was building a picture of institutional failure, of leadership that had allowed standards to erode, of a command climate where respect flowed only upward and never down. It was exactly what she had been sent to find, though no one here knew she had been sent at all. By the 4th day, the mockery had settled into a routine. Keller had become a fixture in the office, someone so thoroughly dismissed that her presence barely registered anymore except as an occasional target for casual derision. Torres and Volkov had taken to discussing her as if she were not there, making comments about her appearance, her competence, her presumed inadequacies with the comfortable cruelty of people who believe themselves entirely safe from consequences. She looks lost every time Cardwell gives her an assignment, Torres said during the morning coffee run, his voice carrying easily across the small office. Like a deer in headlights. How do people like that even make it through basic training? Volkov laughed, stirring sugar into her cup with exaggerated motions. Probably had some sympathetic drill sergeant who felt sorry for her. You know the type. Shows up, does the bare minimum, somehow squeaks by on pity points. Keller continued entering data, her expression unchanging. She had positioned her desk so that the computer monitor's reflection showed her the entire office, allowing her to observe without appearing to watch. It was an old habit, one developed in places where situational awareness meant survival. Here it simply meant she saw everything while appearing to see nothing. Lieutenant Cardwell arrived late, his uniform slightly rumpled, his expression suggesting he had enjoyed too much of something the previous evening. He dropped a new stack of paperwork on Keller's desk without preamble. Incident reports, he said shortly. Need them filed and cross-referenced with personnel records by 1400. Can you handle that, or is it too complicated? The question was rhetorical, delivered with enough condescension to make the insult clear. Keller glanced at the stack, noting immediately that several of the reports were marked with classifications that should not have been left unsecured on someone's desk overnight. "No, sir. I can handle it," she said quietly. "Good," Cardwell replied, already turning away. "Try to get it right this time." The last batch you filed was apparently so confusing that Halverson spent an hour trying to find a document that should have been exactly where the system indicated. Keller said nothing, though she knew precisely why Halverson had struggled. The document he sought had been misfiled years before her arrival, buried in the wrong drawer under the wrong year, because whoever had filed it originally had not bothered to check the date. She had found it during her basement organizing, properly filed it, and updated the database accordingly. Halverson's difficulty came from looking in the wrong place out of habit, assuming the old chaos was still the system. But explaining this would require admitting she had taken initiative beyond her assigned task, and that would only generate more hostility. The incident reports told their own troubling story. 3 formal complaints about Halverson's treatment of junior enlisted personnel in the past 6 months, all of them dismissed or downgraded by Cardwell with minimal investigation. 2 reports of equipment misuse that suggested safety protocols were being routinely ignored. 1 complaint about improper fraternization that had been filed and then mysteriously withdrawn the following day. The pattern was clear to anyone trained to recognize it. This was a unit where accountability had broken down, where the command climate protected those in power rather than those who served under them. At 1100, Specialist Diana Reeves appeared in the doorway. She was younger than the others, perhaps 23, with nervous eyes and a perpetually apologetic posture that suggested she had been thoroughly beaten down by the environment. She knocked softly despite the door being open, waiting for permission to enter. Volkov glanced up with irritation. "What do you want, Reeves?" "I was told to deliver these training schedules to Lieutenant Cardwell," Reeves said, holding out a folder with both hands like an offering. "He is not here. Leave him on his desk and go." Reeves entered quickly, set the folder down, and turned to leave. As she passed Keller's desk, she stumbled slightly, catching herself against the edge. "Sorry," she whispered, though it was unclear who she was apologizing to or for what. Keller looked at her directly for the first time. "Are you all right?" Reeves blinked, startled by the question. "Fine. I am fine." She hurried out before anyone could say more. Torres watched her go with amusement. "That one is even worse than you, Keller. At least you keep quiet and do your work." Reeves jumps at her own shadow. "I give her another month before she requests a transfer or washes out completely." Volkov nodded agreement. "Some people are just not cut out for military life. They should have screening processes that catch these types before they waste everyone's time and resources." The conversation continued, dissecting Reeves's perceived inadequacies with casual brutality. Keller returned to the incident reports, but her mind was working through implications. Reeves's behavior was not natural nervousness. It was the specific kind of wariness that came from operating in a hostile environment, the constant vigilance of someone expecting attack from any quarter. She had seen it before in soldiers serving under toxic leadership, in units where the real enemy was not external but internal. The afternoon stretched into evening. Cardwell returned briefly, glanced at the filed incident reports without actually checking them, and left again without comment. Torres and Volkov packed up precisely at 1700, their departure marked by the usual lack of acknowledgement toward Keller. She waited until the building had gone quiet, then pulled up the personnel database on her computer. The search was quick, efficient, pulling records with the kind of database expertise that came from years of intelligence work. Reeves had filed 3 separate complaints in the past 4 months, all of them regarding Halverson's treatment. All 3 had been dismissed by Cardwell as personality conflicts or misunderstandings. The pattern was textbook, the kind of systematic failure that allowed harassment to flourish unchecked. Keller logged out of the system, gathered her belongings, and locked the office. The evening air was cool against her face as she walked across the base, past buildings where lights burned in scattered windows, past formations of soldiers conducting evening physical training, past the command building where flags hung limp in the still air. She observed it all with the careful attention of someone conducting an assessment, noting strengths and weaknesses, identifying systemic issues that required correction. Tomorrow would bring more of the same mockery, more casual cruelty, more evidence of a command climate that had drifted far from the standards it was meant to uphold. And she would continue to observe, to document, to understand exactly how deep the problems ran. Because in 8 days, everything would change. In 8 days, the inspection would arrive. And in 8 days, they would learn exactly who had been watching them all along. The morning of the 5th day brought a shift in atmosphere. Word had spread through the base that the upcoming inspection was not the routine affair initially suggested, but rather a comprehensive command climate assessment conducted by division headquarters. The news had reached Building 6 through Torres, who arrived looking uncharacteristically nervous, his usual swagger replaced by the jittery energy of someone realizing consequences might actually exist. "Cardwell wants everything perfect," Torres announced, dropping his bag on his desk with unnecessary force. "Every file, every requisition, every piece of paperwork needs to be flawless. Division is sending a full team, and they're going to be looking at everything." Volkov's face had gone pale. What did we find out it was division level? Last night, apparently Battalion thought it was going to be internal only, but Division escalated it. They're sending some Colonel Nobody has heard of to run the whole thing. Keller's fingers paused on her keyboard for just a fraction of a second before continuing their steady rhythm. Her expression remained carefully neutral as she processed this information. The timeline was accelerating, the pieces falling into place faster than originally planned. In 6 days, the truth would emerge. In 6 days, this entire base would understand exactly what had been happening under their noses. Cardwell burst through the door at 0800, his face flushed, sweat visible at his temples despite the cool morning. "Everything needs to be audit-ready by end of day tomorrow," he said, his voice pitched higher than usual. "That means every file properly organized, every database entry verified, every discrepancy resolved. I do not care if you have to work through the night." He turned to Keller, his eyes wild with the particular panic of someone realizing their negligence might finally be exposed. All those requisitions you have been entering. I need a full audit trail showing proper authorization chains. Can you generate that?" "Yes, sir," Keller replied calmly. "When do you need it?" "Yesterday," Cardwell snapped. "But since that is impossible, I need it by 1700 today, and it needs to be perfect." "Do you understand?" "Perfect. No errors, no missing signatures, no gaps in documentation." The problem, of course, was that the requisitions were riddled with errors, missing signatures, and gaps in documentation. Keller had spent days entering records that revealed a systematic failure of oversight, requisitions approved without proper authority, supplies ordered without justification, inventory that existed on paper but not in reality. Creating an audit trail that looked proper would require fabrication, and Cardwell was essentially asking her to help cover up evidence of mismanagement. "I will need access to authorization records to verify signature chains," Keller said carefully. "Fine, whatever," Cardwell said, waving his hand dismissively. "Volkov, get her whatever access she needs. Just make it happen." He left, his departure marked by the sound of his boots pounding down the stairs with urgent speed. The moment he was gone, Torres let out a long breath. "We are so screwed," he muttered. "If Division finds even half the issues in our records, Cardwell is finished. And probably Halverson too." Volkov turned to Keller, her earlier hostility replaced by something closer to desperation. "Look, I know we have not exactly been welcoming, but right now we need everyone working together. Can you actually fix the requisition records or not?" It was a fascinating moment, watching the hierarchy dissolve under pressure, watching people who had spent days treating her with contempt suddenly recognizing they might need her competence. Keller met Volkov's eyes steadily. I can generate an accurate audit trail showing the actual authorization chain for each requisition. Accurate, Torres repeated. That is not what Cardwell asked for. He asked for an audit trail showing proper authorization chains, Keller said. I can show what authorizations actually exist in the records. Whether they are proper is a different question. The implications hung in the air. Volkov and Torres exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. You are saying the records are not going to pass inspection no matter what you do, Volkov said slowly. I am saying the records reflect the actual practices of this office over the past several years, Keller replied. I can organize them clearly and make them accessible. I cannot change what has already been documented. Torres slumped in his chair. We are completely screwed. The day progressed with mounting tension. Halverson appeared twice, each time more agitated than the last, demanding updates and barking orders that contradicted instructions given an hour before. Junior enlisted personnel moved through the building with the hunched shoulders of people trying to become invisible, sensing the stress rolling off their superiors and wanting no part of it. At 1400, Specialist Reeves appeared again, this time carrying a box of old files that had been requested from storage. She set them on Keller's desk with careful precision, her hands shaking slightly. Lieutenant Cardwell said you needed these for the audit, she said quietly. Thank you, Keller replied. Reeves turned to go, then hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder. Is it true that Division is really sending a full team? Her voice was barely above a whisper. That is what I have heard. Reeves nodded slowly, something like hope flickering briefly in her eyes before she shuddered away. She left without another word. But the exchange had been noted by both Torres and Volkov, who watched with the wary attention of people suddenly aware that junior personnel might have their own perspectives on how the office functioned. Keller worked through the afternoon, generating reports that laid bare the systematic failures of leadership, authorization chains that revealed Cardwell approving requisitions he lacked authority to approve, supply orders that violated procurement regulations, inventory discrepancies that suggested either incompetence or something darker. Each document was meticulously accurate, properly formatted, exactly what had been requested. The fact that accuracy would prove damning was not her fault. At 1600, she printed the preliminary audit and carried it to Cardwell's office. He was on the phone, his voice strained as he spoke to someone who was clearly above him in the chain of command. Yes, sir. Everything is in order, sir. We are ready for the inspection, sir. He hung up and grabbed the audit from Keller's hand, his eyes scanning the pages with increasing horror. This is, he started, then stopped. This shows, he tried again, his voice failing him. This shows the actual authorization chain for every requisition filed in the past 3 years, Keller said calmly. As you requested. Cardwell's face had gone from flushed to ashen. His hands trembled as he flipped through pages, seeing his own signature on documents he should never have approved, seeing gaps where oversight should have existed, seeing the undeniable evidence of his own failures compiled with ruthless efficiency. Who is going to see this? He asked, his voice barely audible. The inspection team will have access to all audit materials, Keller replied. That is standard protocol for command climate assessments. Cardwell looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time since she had arrived, and something in his expression shifted. Who are you? He asked. Keller held Cardwell's gaze without flinching. I'm Specialist Keller, sir. Temporary administrative support from Fort Benning, as indicated in my assignment orders. Cardwell stared at her for a long moment, his expression caught between suspicion and panic. Something was wrong, his instincts finally catching up to what his arrogance had prevented him from seeing earlier. No temporary admin specialist had the expertise to generate an audit this comprehensive, this damning, this professionally executed. But he was trapped now, unable to question her, without admitting he had never properly verified her credentials, without revealing that he had been too dismissive to actually read her assignment paperwork beyond the most basic details. Get out, he said finally, his voice tight. I need to review this. Keller returned to her desk, where Torres and Volkov sat in heavy silence. The office felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with the weight of impending consequences. Neither of them looked at her directly, but she could sense their awareness of her presence had changed. They were beginning to understand that something was not quite right, that the woman they had spent days mocking might be something other than what she appeared. Torres broke first. "Where did you actually work at Fort Benning?" he asked, trying to sound casual and failing completely. "Operational planning," Keller replied, the same answer she had given Halverson days ago. This time it landed differently, weighted with implications neither Torres nor Volkov wanted to examine too closely. "What kind of operational planning?" Volkov pressed. "The kind that requires security clearance to discuss in detail." The silence that followed was profound. Torres and Volkov exchanged glances again, their earlier camaraderie now tinged with mutual recrimination. How much had they said in front of her? How many casual insults? How many violations of protocol? How many admissions of cutting corners and ignoring regulations had they made, while assuming she was too insignificant to matter? The phone on Cardwell's desk rang, the sound shrill in the tense quiet. Through his open door, they could hear him answer, hear his voice crack slightly as he spoke. "Yes, sir, the audit is complete." "No, sir. There are some discrepancies that we are working to resolve." "Yes, sir. I understand the timeline." He emerged from his office looking 10 years older, his careful grooming disheveled, his uniform wrinkled where he had been gripping the fabric. "Staff Sergeant Halverson is coming in for an emergency meeting," he announced to no one in particular. "We need to discuss how to present these findings in the most favorable light possible." Volkov leaned forward. "Sir, is there any way to—" She paused, searching for words that would not constitute admitting to wrongdoing, to contextualize some of the authorization issues. "Perhaps if we explain the operational tempo, the resource constraints." Cardwell cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Do not say anything else. Not here, not now. We will discuss options when Halverson arrives." But the look he shot toward Keller suggested he was already questioning whether discussing options in front of her was wise. The prey animal instinct was finally kicking in, too late to matter, but strong enough to make him wary. He retreated back into his office, closing the door this time, leaving Torres and Volkov sitting in uncomfortable silence with a woman they were beginning to fear might have been listening far more carefully than they had ever imagined. Halverson arrived at 1700, his expression thunderous. He barely glanced at Keller as he stormed past her desk toward Cardwell's office, but she noticed the slight hesitation in his step, the brief moment where his eyes flicked toward her with something that might have been uncertainty. He disappeared behind Cardwell's door, and the sound of raised voices immediately filtered through the thin walls. "This is your fault," Halverson's voice carried clearly. "You should have been managing these records properly from the beginning. You're the officer. This falls on you." "Do not try to shift blame onto me," Cardwell shot back. "You are the one who has been running this administrative section like your personal fiefdom. Half these authorization issues stem from your insistence on bypassing proper channels." The argument escalated, professional courtesy dissolving as panic stripped away pretense. Torres and Volkov sat frozen at their desks, pretending not to hear while obviously hearing everything. Keller continued working, her fingers steady on the keyboard, entering the last of the requisition data with the same methodical precision she had maintained since arriving. The office door flew open and Halverson emerged, his face red with fury. He stalked toward Keller's desk, looming over her with his full bulk. "You," he said, pointing a thick finger at her face. "What exactly did you put in that audit?" "An accurate representation of the authorization chains as they exist in the documented records," Keller replied calmly. "Did you include recommendations? Interpretations? Any kind of editorial commentary about what you found?" "No, Staff Sergeant. The audit contains only factual data from the existing files." Halverson stared at her, his jaw working as he struggled with something. Finally, he leaned down, bringing his face close to hers in a clear attempt at intimidation. "I do not know what your game is, Keller, but I want you to understand something very clearly. When this inspection is over, when division leaves and everything goes back to normal, you're going to be gone. Transferred, reassigned, I do not care. But you will not be here. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Keller said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I understand perfectly." There was something in her tone, some subtle inflection that made Halverson pause. For just a moment, uncertainty crossed his features, a fleeting recognition that perhaps he was missing something crucial. But his arrogance reasserted itself quickly, drowning out intuition under the weight of 20 years of unchecked authority. "Good," he said, straightening up. "Remember that. You are temporary. We are permanent. Act accordingly." He returned to Cardwell's office, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Volkov had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her belongings. Torres simply stared at his computer screen, his expression suggesting he was replaying every conversation, every dismissive comment, every casual cruelty with new understanding of how thoroughly documented it all might be. At 1800, Keller logged out of her computer, secured the file she had been working on, and prepared to leave. As she reached the door, Volkov spoke, her voice small and uncertain. "Keller," she said, then stopped. Keller turned, waiting. "Whatever happens with the inspection," Volkov continued, "I just want you to know that she could not finish the apology or excuse or plea catching in her throat." Keller nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged the attempt without accepting or forgiving, and left the office. Behind her, she heard Volkov let out a shaky breath, heard Torres mutter something about everything being completely insane. The evening air was crisp as she walked across the base, past buildings now lit against the gathering darkness, past formations of soldiers completing their duties, past the command building where senior officers worked late, preparing for an inspection they did not yet understand would change everything. In 5 days, the truth would emerge. In 5 days, the facade would crumble. And everyone who had dismissed her, mocked her, underestimated her, would finally understand exactly what they had allowed to happen while they were busy proving their own superiority over someone they never bothered to actually see. The 6th day dawned gray and cold, the kind of weather that matched the mood settling over Fort Ashford like a heavy blanket. Word of the comprehensive nature of the division inspection had spread through unofficial channels, the way information always traveled faster through rumor than through official communications. Junior enlisted personnel moved through their duties with nervous energy, while senior leaders held closed-door meetings that generated more anxiety than clarity. Keller arrived at Building 6 to find the office already occupied by all 3 of her supposed colleagues. Cardwell stood near the window, his uniform immaculate again, as if perfect appearance might somehow compensate for systematic failures. Torres and Volkov sat at their desks in unusual silence, their earlier casual cruelty replaced by the subdued demeanor of people waiting for judgment. "Today we focus on presentation," Cardwell announced without preamble. "The division team arrives tomorrow at 0700. Every file will be accessible. Every database query will return accurate results. Every question will be answered with precision and professionalism." He turned to look directly at Keller for the first time, with something approaching respect, or perhaps fear. "Specialist Keller, your audit has been forwarded to Battalion. They will be reviewing it today and may have questions. You will make yourself available to answer any inquiries." "Yes, sir," Keller replied. The morning passed in tense preparation. Halverson appeared twice, each visit marked by barely controlled agitation. His usual swagger had been replaced by the jerky movements of someone operating on insufficient sleep and excessive stress. During his second visit, he pulled Cardwell aside for a whispered conversation that nevertheless carried across the small office. "Did you verify her clearance level?" Halverson hissed. "Did you actually check what kind of access she had at Benning?" "She's just admin support," Cardwell replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The assignment orders were standard. Standard assignment orders do not produce audits like that. Someone with her level of analytical capability or database expertise, that is not standard anything. "Then what are you suggesting?" Halverson's response was too quiet to hear, but his expression spoke volumes. Suspicion had finally taken root, far too late to matter, but strong enough to poison the atmosphere further. When they emerged from their conference, both men looked at Keller with naked wariness, like handlers who had just realized the animal they thought domesticated might actually be apex predator. At 1100, a call came through from battalion headquarters. Cardwell took it in his office, his responses clipped and increasingly strained. When he emerged 15 minutes later, his face had gone ashen. "They want to interview Keller," he said, directing the comment to Halverson, who had lingered in the office. Battalion executive officer specifically requested her presence at 1400 to discuss the audit findings. Torres and Volkov exchanged glances. "That is unusual," Volkov said carefully. "Battalion does not typically interview junior enlisted about administrative audits." "Apparently, this one is different," Cardwell replied tersely. He looked at Keller. "You are to report to battalion headquarters, Building 1, second floor, at 1350. Do not be late." "No, sir," Keller said. The hours until 1350 crawled past with excruciating slowness. The office felt like a pressure cooker, everyone hyper-aware of Keller's presence. Their earlier dismissiveness transformed into anxious observation. No one spoke to her directly, but she could feel their attention, could sense them trying to reconcile the unremarkable woman at the corner desk with the growing suspicion that she might be something entirely different. At 1340, Keller stood and gathered her cover. Torres broke the silence with a question that had clearly been building all morning. "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth," Keller replied simply. "That is all I have ever documented." She left the office, walking across the base toward battalion headquarters with the unhurried pace of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Behind her, she knew Torres and Volkov were probably engaged in panic speculation, probably calling Cardwell to report her departure, probably trying to game out scenarios and damage control strategies. The battalion headquarters building was imposing, 3 stories of brick and glass that housed the administrative heart of Fort Ashford. Keller climbed the stairs to the second floor, presented herself to the receptionist at precisely 1350, and was immediately ushered into a conference room where 3 officers waited. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Vance sat at the head of the table, her silver oak leaves gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested a career built on competence rather than politics. To her right sat Major Thomas Wu, the battalion executive officer, his expression neutral and assessing. To her left sat a captain Keller did not recognize, her name tape reading Sullivan, a legal pad covered in notes sitting before her. "Specialist Keller," Vance said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." Keller took the indicated seat, her posture perfect, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The 3 officers studied her for a long moment, and Keller saw the exact instant when Vance recognized something in her bearing, some subtle indicator that suggested military experience far beyond what her rank implied. "Your audit of the administrative section was extraordinarily thorough," Vance said. "The level of detail, the analytical framework, the systematic documentation of authorization failures. This is not typical work from a temporary administrative assignment." "I documented what existed in the records, ma'am," Keller replied. "Yes, you did, with a level of expertise that raises questions. Major Wu pulled your service record from Fort Benning this morning." He looked at her significantly. "It required quite a few phone calls to get the complete file. It seems your assignment here was somewhat unusual in its authorization chain." The room fell silent. Keller met Vance's eyes steadily, seeing understanding dawn in the older woman's expression. "You're not actually here for temporary administrative duty, are you, Specialist Keller?" Vance said quietly. "Or perhaps specialist is not your actual rank." "My assignment orders are genuine, ma'am," Keller replied carefully, "as is my presence here for purposes of assessment." Vance leaned back in her chair, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Assessment. Yes, that is certainly one word for it. How long have you been conducting this assessment?" 6 days, ma'am." "And in those 6 days, what exactly have you assessed?" Keller took a breath, then began to speak with the precision of someone delivering a formal report. "Systematic failures of leadership at the administrative section level. casual violation of authorization protocols, habitual disregard for proper oversight procedures, a command climate that tolerates and in some cases actively encourages disrespect toward junior personnel, multiple formal complaints dismissed without adequate investigation, evidence of potential misuse of government resources, and a pervasive culture of impunity among senior enlisted and junior officers who believe their positions insulate them from accountability. The words hung in the air like indictments. Captain Sullivan had stopped taking notes, her pen frozen above the legal pad. Major Wu's expression had shifted from neutral to grim. Vance simply nodded slowly, as if hearing confirmation of suspicions she had held for some time. "This is going to be a very interesting inspection," Vance said finally. She looked at Keller with something approaching respect. "I assume you will be present tomorrow when the division team arrives?" "Yes, ma'am," Keller replied. "I believe my presence has been specifically requested." "I am certain it has," Vance said. "Tell me, Specialist Keller, or whoever you actually are, do Lieutenant Cardwell and Staff Sergeant Halverson have any idea what is about to happen to them?" "No, ma'am," Keller said. "I do not believe they do." The seventh day arrived with the weight of inevitability. Keller returned to Building 6 at 0700 to find Cardwell and Halverson already present, both men radiating the particular tension of people who knew something was wrong but could not identify the specific threat. Torres and Volkov arrived minutes later, their expressions suggesting sleepless nights spent contemplating uncertain futures. "The division inspection team arrives in 1 hour," Cardwell announced, his voice brittle with forced confidence. "All personnel will present themselves professionally. All questions will be answered directly and honestly. Any attempts to conceal information or mislead the inspection team will result in immediate disciplinary action." The irony of this instruction, given the past week of systematic concealment and misleading behavior, was apparently lost on him. Halverson nodded agreement, his jaw set in the stubborn line of someone preparing for battle rather than accountability. "Specialist Keller," Cardwell continued, "you will make yourself available to brief the inspection team on your audit findings. Keep your responses factual and concise. Do not offer opinions or interpretations beyond what is documented." "Yes, sir," Keller replied. At 0755, the sound of vehicles pulling up outside drew everyone to the windows. 3 official sedans had arrived, disgorging personnel in crisp uniforms who moved with the purposeful efficiency of people executing a well-rehearsed plan. Keller recognized the lead figure immediately, though she gave no outward sign of recognition. Colonel James Hartford, Division Chief of Staff, a man known throughout the command for his zero-tolerance approach to leadership failures and his legendary ability to identify institutional rot. "They are early," Torres whispered, as if the 5-minute difference mattered at all in the face of what was coming. "Professional inspection teams are always early," Keller said quietly. "It allows them to observe unguarded reactions and spontaneous responses." Torres looked at her sharply. "How would you know that?" Before Keller could respond, boots sounded on the stairs and the office door opened. Colonel Hartford entered first, his presence immediately dominating the small space. He was perhaps 55, tall and lean with silver hair and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. Behind him came 2 majors and a captain, all carrying tablets of folders, all wearing expressions of professional neutrality that somehow felt more ominous than outright hostility. "Lieutenant Cardwell," Hartford said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone who valued efficiency over pleasantries. "I am Colonel Hartford, Division Chief of Staff. This is my inspection team. We will begin with a review of your administrative processes and then conduct individual interviews with your personnel." "Yes, sir," Cardwell replied, his voice cracking slightly. "We have prepared comprehensive briefing materials, and all of our records are available for review." "I'm sure they are," Hartford said dryly. His eyes swept the office, cataloging everything before settling on Keller. "You must be Specialist Keller. I have read your audit with great interest." "Yes, sir," Keller replied, standing at attention. "We will speak shortly. First, however, I would like Staff Sergeant Halverson and Lieutenant Cardwell to provide an overview of how this administrative section operates." His smile was thin and predatory. "I am particularly interested in your authorization protocols and oversight procedures." The next hour was excruciating to witness. Cardwell and Halverson took turns attempting to explain systems that had no logical foundation, defending practices that violated basic military regulations, justifying decisions that had no defensible justification. With each question Hartford posed, with each gentle probe from his team, the facade crumbled a little more. Torres and Volkov sat frozen at their desks, occasionally called upon to confirm details that only deepened the hole their superiors were digging. At 0900, Hartford called a halt. "Thank you for that overview," he said, his tone suggesting anything but gratitude. "I would now like to speak with Specialist Keller privately. Lieutenant Cardwell, Staff Sergeant Halverson, please wait in the hallway." "Sir," Halverson began, "I think it would be appropriate for me to remain during—" "That was not a request," Staff Sergeant Hartford cut him off. "Wait in the hallway." They filed out reluctantly, Halverson shooting Keller a look of pure venom as he passed. The door closed behind them, and Hartford turned to his team. "Clear the room," he said quietly. "I need to speak with the specialist alone." The majors and captain departed without question, leaving Hartford and Keller facing each other in sudden silence. Hartford studied her for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Colonel," he said formally. Keller returned the salute, her own movements precise and practiced. "Sir," she replied. Hartford relaxed slightly, shaking his head with something approaching amusement. "Colonel Adrian Keller, if I remember correctly from the briefing packet. 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, a master's degree in organizational psychology, and currently assigned to Division G1 with a specialty in command climate assessments." He paused. "When General Morrison told me he was sending someone undercover to evaluate this base, I assumed it would be a captain or major. Sending a full colonel was either brilliant or insane. The situation warranted a senior officer's assessment," Keller replied. "The preliminary reports suggested systemic issues that required experienced evaluation." "Systemic issues," Hartford repeated. "That is certainly one way to describe what I have seen this morning. What is your overall assessment?" "The administrative section demonstrates multiple failures of leadership, oversight, and basic military professionalism. Lieutenant Cardwell lacks the competence and ethical foundation necessary for his position. Staff Sergeant Halverson has created a toxic environment that prioritizes personal authority over proper protocol. The junior personnel are either complicit in the dysfunction or too intimidated to report it through proper channels." "And the broader base command?" Hartford's question hung in the air. Keller chose her words carefully. "The issues in the administrative section are symptomatic of larger problems. A command climate that allows such behavior to persist unchecked for years suggests either willful ignorance or inadequate oversight at multiple levels of leadership." Hartford nodded slowly. "I have reached similar conclusions. The question now is remediation. What do you recommend?" "Immediate relief of both Cardwell and Halverson from their current positions. Formal investigation into authorization violations and potential misuse of resources. Mandatory retraining for all administrative personnel. And a comprehensive review of base-wide command climate to identify whether similar issues exist in other sections. That is going to generate significant disruption. The disruption of proper accountability is preferable to the continuation of dysfunction," Keller replied. "These soldiers deserve better leadership. The mission deserves better execution. And the military as an institution deserves leaders who understand that rank is a responsibility, not a license for impunity." Hartford smiled, a genuine expression this time. "General Morrison said you were direct. He understated the case." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more question, Colonel. How did they treat you this past week? Before they suspected anything was wrong?" Keller's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "They treated me exactly as I expected they would treat someone they believed was powerless and beneath their notice. with casual cruelty, systemic disrespect, and the kind of contempt that reveals character far more clearly than any formal evaluation could. Good, Hartford said quietly. Then they earned everything that is about to happen to them. Hartford opened the door to find Cardwell and Halverson waiting in the hallway, their postures rigid with tension. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that particular quality of calm that preceded storms. "Please return to the office. We need to discuss some findings." They filed back in, Halverson's eyes immediately seeking Keller with undisguised hostility. She stood near the window now, her posture different somehow, straighter and more commanding than the meek stance she had maintained all week. Cardwell noticed it too, his expression shifting from nervous to confused as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. Hartford settled himself at Cardwell's desk without asking permission, a power move that made the lieutenant visibly flinch. "Specialist Keller and I have been reviewing the audit findings," he began. "I have some questions about the authorization chains documented here. Specifically, I am interested in understanding how Lieutenant Cardwell came to approve requisitions that exceeded his authority level by significant margins." Cardwell's face went pale. "Sir, those requisitions were approved based on operational necessity and in direct violation of procurement regulations," Hartford interrupted. "Unless you are claiming ignorance of the regulations, which would suggest a different but equally serious problem." Halverson stepped forward, his bulk intended as intimidation. "Sir, with respect, this audit was conducted by a junior enlisted specialist with no oversight or verification. I question the accuracy of—" Hartford held up a hand, silencing him. "Staff Sergeant Halverson, are you suggesting that the documentation in your own filing system is inaccurate? Because this audit is based entirely on records that your section created and maintained." The logic trap closed around Halverson like a vice. His mouth worked soundlessly as he tried to find an escape that did not exist. Beside him, Cardwell had begun to understand that something fundamental had shifted, that the rules of engagement had changed in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. "Sir," Cardwell said carefully, "may I ask what the scope of this inspection actually entails? When we were initially briefed, we were told this would be a standard administrative review." "Plans change, Lieutenant," Hartford replied. "Sometimes new information comes to light that requires expanded investigation." He looked directly at Keller. "Sometimes that information comes from unexpected sources." The pieces were starting to fall into place for Cardwell. His eyes moved from Hartford to Keller and back again, recognition dawning with the slow horror of someone realizing they had been played from the beginning. "She is not really just a specialist, is she?" he said quietly. Hartford smiled. "Why do you ask that, Lieutenant?" "Because no specialist produces work like that audit. Because Battalion specifically requested her for interview. Because you just spent 30 minutes alone with her discussing findings that should have been discussed with me first as the officer in charge." He turned to look at Keller directly. "Who are you really?" Keller met his gaze steadily, but said nothing. It was Hartford who answered. "Specialist Keller is exactly who her orders say she is. A temporary administrative support assignment from Fort Benning." He paused significantly. "Of course, those orders were generated by the Division G1 office for specific purposes related to command climate assessment. But the orders themselves are entirely legitimate." "Command climate assessment," Halverson repeated, his voice hollow. "You sent someone undercover to spy on us." "I sent someone to observe how this base functions when senior leadership believes no one important is watching," Hartford corrected. "The results have been illuminating." He opened a folder, scanning pages with theatrical deliberation. Multiple formal complaints dismissed without adequate investigation. Systematic violations of authorization protocols. Evidence of hostile work environment toward junior personnel. And most damningly, a pattern of behavior suggesting that those in positions of authority believe themselves immune to accountability. Torres and Volkov had shrunk into their chairs, trying to become invisible. Hartford's gaze swept over them briefly before returning to Cardwell and Halverson. "You two treated Specialist Keller with open contempt from the moment she arrived. You dismissed her competence, mocked her presence, and made it clear through both word and action that you considered her beneath your notice. He leaned forward. That behavior tells me everything I need to know about how you treat all the junior personnel under your supervision. Sir, Halverson began, his voice taking on a pleading quality entirely foreign to his usual bluster. If you had known she was someone important, you would have treated her with respect. Hartford finished. Yes, Staff Sergeant, I understand completely. That is precisely the problem. Respect should not be conditional on rank or perceived importance. It should be the baseline of how we treat every soldier who serves. Cardwell had gone beyond pale to a grayish pallor that suggested physical illness. What happens now? He asked. Now we conduct formal interviews with all personnel in this section and several others across the base. We review every complaint that has been filed in the past year. We examine authorization records in detail, and we make recommendations to the division commander regarding appropriate administrative and disciplinary actions. Hartford closed the folder with finality. But I can tell you right now that those recommendations will include immediate relief from current duties for both of you pending the outcome of formal investigation. The words landed like artillery strikes. Halverson's face went from red to purple, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. This is garbage, he said, his voice rising. One specialist with an agenda comes in here, and suddenly 20 years of service means nothing? Your 20 years of service means exactly what your behavior over those 20 years demonstrated, Hartford replied coldly. And if the past week is any indication, you have spent that time building a personal empire rather than serving the mission or the soldiers under your leadership. Halverson took a step forward, his posture aggressive. Hartford did not move, but two military police officers who had been waiting in the hallway chose that moment to enter the office, their presence a clear statement about what would happen if Halverson's anger turned physical. Staff Sergeant, Hartford said quietly, I strongly suggest you remember where you are and who you are addressing. The hole you have dug is already deep enough. Do not make it worse. Halverson froze, reality crashing down on him with crushing weight. His career was over. 2 decades of service would end not with honor, but with relief for cause, with letters of reprimand, possibly with formal charges depending on what the investigation uncovered. All because he had spent a week treating someone with contempt, never imagining that person had the authority and mandate to document his every failure. Lieutenant Cardwell, Staff Sergeant Halverson, Hartford said formally, you are both relieved of duty effective immediately. You will report to Building 1 at 1400 for formal interviews. Until that time, you're not to discuss this matter with anyone. You are not to access any files or databases related to your former duties, and you're not to contact any personnel in this section. Do you understand these instructions? Yes, sir, they replied in unison, their voices defeated. You are dismissed. They left like condemned men, their footsteps heavy on the stairs. The office fell into shocked silence. Torres and Volkov sat paralyzed, afraid to move or speak. Hartford turned his attention to them with an expression that suggested their fates were still very much undecided. As for you two, he said, his voice softer but no less serious, we will be speaking at length about your roles in this situation. I suggest you spend the time between now and your interviews thinking very carefully about honesty, accountability, and the difference between following bad leadership and enabling it. The 8th day of Keller's assignment to Fort Ashford began differently than the previous 7. She arrived at 0600, not to Building 6, but to battalion headquarters where a temporary office had been established for the duration of the inspection. Colonel Hartford was already present, reviewing interview transcripts and documentation with his team. Good morning, Colonel Keller, he said, gesturing to the coffee station. We have a full day ahead. The base commander has requested a preliminary briefing at 0900, and we have 12 more interviews scheduled throughout the day. Keller poured herself coffee, noting the quality was significantly better than what had been available in Building 6. How did the interviews with Torres and Volkov go yesterday afternoon? Hartford's expression was grim, illuminating. Once they understood their own positions were at risk, they became remarkably forthcoming about the culture in that office. Torres admitted to witnessing Halverson berate junior personnel on multiple occasions. Volkov confirmed that complaint forms have been discouraged and in some cases actively suppressed. Will they face disciplinary action? That depends on several factors, including their level of cooperation going forward and whether they demonstrate genuine understanding of their failures. Hartford set down his tablet. But I want to discuss something else with you. Your assessment mentioned that the administrative section issues might be symptomatic of larger problems. I need you to expand on that. Keller took a seat across from him. The toxicity in Building 6 did not develop in isolation. It persisted because higher levels of leadership either did not know or did not care to know what was happening. Battalion leadership should have caught the authorization violations during routine audits. The base commander should have noticed patterns in complaint filings or lack thereof. The command sergeant major should have been maintaining awareness of enlisted morale and welfare. You are suggesting institutional failure beyond just Cardwell and Halverson. I am suggesting that what we found in Building 6 is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a command climate that has become complacent, that has allowed standards to erode gradually over time until behavior that should be shocking becomes normalized. Hartford nodded slowly. General Morrison suspected as much when he authorized your assessment. That is why he sent a colonel rather than a junior officer. He needed someone with the experience to see the whole picture, not just the immediate problem. The briefing at 0900 brought together the senior leadership of Fort Ashford in a conference room that suddenly felt too small for the weight of what was about to be discussed. Colonel Raymond Thatcher, the base commander, sat at the head of the table. He was a career officer nearing retirement, his face deeply lined and his eyes carrying the particular weariness of someone who had seen too many problems and solved too few of them. Beside him sat Command Sergeant Major Frank Desmond, a hulking man whose expression suggested he already knew this briefing would not go well. Hartford stood at the front of the room, Keller beside him. The preliminary findings of our command climate assessment are serious enough to warrant immediate attention. Hartford began without preamble. We have identified systematic failures of leadership, oversight, and basic military professionalism in the administrative section of Building 6. But our investigation suggests these issues extend beyond that single office. He activated the presentation display, showing a chart that mapped complaint patterns across the entire base over the past 2 years. Note the declining trend in formal complaints filed, Thatcher noted. On paper, this looks like improving morale. In reality, based on our interviews with junior personnel, this represents increasing reluctance to report problems through official channels because previous complaints have been dismissed or resulted in retaliation. Thatcher's face had gone stony. That is a serious allegation, Colonel. It is a serious finding, sir, Hartford replied, and it is supported by substantial evidence. He clicked to the next slide, showing authorization violations, supply discrepancies, and training deficiencies documented across multiple units. The administrative section was simply the most egregious example, but the pattern repeats throughout the base. Command Sergeant Major Desmond leaned forward. Are you suggesting my NCO Corps has failed in their basic responsibilities? I am suggesting that the command climate has allowed a culture of impunity to develop, Hartford said carefully. When senior personnel believe they can treat subordinates with contempt without consequences, when violations of protocol are overlooked in the name of getting things done, when maintaining the appearance of success becomes more important than addressing actual problems, then yes, there has been a systematic failure at all levels of leadership. The room fell silent. Keller watched the faces around the table, seeing anger, defensiveness, and in a few cases, the beginning of genuine understanding. One major, a man whose name tape read Phillips, spoke up. With respect, Colonel Hartford, how can we trust these findings when they are based on information gathered through deception? You sent someone undercover to spy on us. That hardly seems like a foundation for fair assessment. Hartford turned to Keller. Colonel Keller, would you care to address that concern? The room erupted in confused murmurs. Keller stepped forward, her posture shifting subtly as she dropped the meek bearing she had maintained for a week. Colonel Adrian Keller, Division G1, she said calmly. My assessment was conducted at the direction of the division commanding general based on preliminary reports suggesting serious command climate issues at Fort Ashford. The methodology was approved at the highest levels precisely because we needed to observe how personnel behave when they believe no one important is watching. Thatcher stared at her, recognition slowly dawning. You're a full colonel. You spent a week being treated like a junior enlisted specialist. Yes, sir. And in that week, I was subjected to casual disrespect, systematic dismissal of my competence, and behavior that violated basic standards of military professionalism. More importantly, I observed similar treatment directed at genuinely junior personnel who lacked the authority or experience to defend themselves. Phillips looked like he had been struck. A colonel, he repeated numbly. The rank is less important than the behavior it revealed, Keller continued. Lieutenant Cardwell and Staff Sergeant Halverson treated me with contempt because they believed I was powerless. That same contempt extends to every soldier under their supervision who lacks the rank or connections to push back. The question this base needs to answer is not whether my assessment was fair, but whether the behavior I had documented represents the kind of leadership you want representing Fort Ashford. Command Sergeant Major Desmond had gone very quiet, his expression suggesting internal calculation. Ma'am, he said finally, addressing Keller directly, in your assessment, how widespread are these issues beyond the administrative section? Keller met his gaze steadily. That is what the rest of this inspection will determine, Sergeant Major. But based on preliminary interviews and documentation review, I believe we will find similar patterns in at least 3 other sections. The administrative office was not unique. It was simply the most visible example of a systemic problem. Thatcher closed his eyes briefly, the weight of decades of service visible in the lines of his face. What are your recommendations, Colonel Hartford? Immediate relief of Lieutenant Cardwell and Staff Sergeant Halverson, pending formal investigation. Comprehensive review of all formal complaints filed in the past 2 years, with particular attention to those that were dismissed without adequate documentation. Mandatory retraining for all officers and senior NCOs on command climate and proper complaint procedures. An establishment of an independent reporting mechanism for junior personnel to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. That is going to generate significant upheaval, Thatcher said quietly. The alternative is allowing the current culture to continue, Hartford replied. Which would you prefer, sir? The temporary disruption of correction or the permanent damage of institutional rot? The 9th day brought the full weight of institutional reckoning. Word had spread through unofficial channels about the true nature of the inspection, about the colonel who had spent a week disguised as a junior specialist, about the systematic dismantling of what personnel had believed was normal. The base moved through its duties with the subdued atmosphere of an organization confronting uncomfortable truths. Keller spent the morning conducting interviews in a conference room that had been converted into a temporary assessment center. Junior enlisted personnel arrived nervous and left with expressions that ranged from relief to vindication to lingering fear that speaking truth might still carry consequences. The stories they told painted a picture of pervasive dysfunction, of leadership that demanded respect while offering none, of a culture where survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. Specialist Diana Reeves arrived for her interview at 10:00, her hands trembling slightly as she took the offered seat. Keller recognized the fear in her eyes, the same wariness she had observed in Building 6 when Reeves had stumbled past her desk. Specialist Reeves, Keller began gently. This is a safe space for honest conversation. Nothing you say here will result in retaliation. You have my word on that. Reeves looked at her with something like wonder. You really are, Colonel. I heard the rumors, but I did not believe it. I really am. And I really did spend a week watching how you and others were treated. I saw you in the administrative office. I saw how nervous you were, how carefully you moved, how quickly you apologized for things that were not your fault. Tears welled in Reeves's eyes. I filed 3 complaints about Staff Sergeant Halverson. He called me worthless in front of other soldiers. He gave me assignments designed to make me fail. He told me I should quit because I was wasting everyone's time. And every complaint I filed was dismissed by Lieutenant Cardwell as a personality conflict. Did anyone else witness this behavior? Dozens of people. But nobody wanted to back me up because they were afraid of becoming targets themselves. And I understood that. I did not blame them. Halverson had been there for years. He had connections. I was just a specialist who had been on base for 6 months. Keller leaned forward. Specialist Reeves, I need you to understand something very clearly. What happened to you was not a personality conflict. It was abuse of authority. It was a failure of leadership. And it was enabled by a command climate that protected perpetrators rather than victims. None of that was your fault. Reeves wiped at her eyes. Is he really gone? Halverson? He has been relieved of duty and is under investigation. He will not be returning to that office or any supervisory position. The same is true for Lieutenant Cardwell. What about Torres and Volkov? They knew what was happening. They never said anything. Their cases are still under review, but they will face consequences appropriate to their level of complicity. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, Reeves's testimony adding detail and context to patterns Keller had already identified. When it concluded, Reeves stood to leave, then paused at the door. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you let them treat you that way? You were a colonel. You could have stopped it at any moment. Keller considered the question carefully. Because I needed to understand what it felt like to be powerless in their system. I needed to experience firsthand the casual cruelty, the systematic dismissal, the assumption that rank gave them the right to treat others with contempt. If I had revealed my true position immediately, they would have changed their behavior. I would have seen the performance they put on for senior officers, not the reality that junior personnel live with every day. Reeves nodded slowly, understanding dawning. So you stood in for all of us. You let them do to you what they had been doing to us, so someone with authority would finally understand. Exactly. Thank you, ma'am, Reeves said quietly. Thank you for seeing us. After Reeves departed, Colonel Hartford entered the conference room. He had been conducting his own interviews in the adjacent space. That looked emotional, he observed. Specialist Reeves has been systematically harassed for months, Keller replied. Her complaints were dismissed, her concerns were minimized, and she was made to feel that her very presence was a problem. The fact that she is still here, still trying to serve despite all of that, speaks to her strength of character. Hartford sat down heavily. I have heard similar stories all morning. Different names, different specifics, but the same underlying pattern. Junior personnel treated as inconvenient obstacles rather than soldiers worthy of respect. He ran a hand through his silver hair. This is going to require more than just relieving a few bad leaders. This is going to require cultural transformation, which starts at the top, Keller said. Command Sergeant Major Desmond seemed genuinely shocked by some of the findings yesterday. That suggests either he was deliberately kept in the dark or he was not doing his job of maintaining awareness of enlisted welfare. My assessment is that he has been focused on mission accomplishment to the exclusion of climate concerns. He assumed that lack of formal complaints meant absence of problems rather than suppression of reporting. That is a failure of leadership at the senior enlisted level. Yes, Hartford agreed, and I will be recommending remedial training at a minimum, possibly relief, depending on what the rest of this investigation uncovers. He looked at Keller directly. General Morrison chose well when he sent you for this assessment. A more junior officer might have documented the surface problems without understanding the systemic nature of the failure. The surface problems are always symptoms, Keller replied. The real disease is the culture that allows them to flourish. That is what needs treatment, not just the individual actors. The afternoon brought a base-wide formation, announced with minimal advance notice. Personnel assembled on the parade ground in the cool air, their expressions ranging from curious to anxious as they waited for senior leadership to address them. Colonel Thatcher stood at the podium, Command Sergeant Major Desmond beside him, with Colonel Hartford and Keller positioned slightly behind. Thatcher spoke without notes, his voice carrying across the formation with the authority of 3 decades in uniform. Soldiers of Fort Ashford, The past week has revealed serious deficiencies in our command climate. Behavior that should never have been tolerated was allowed to persist. Personnel who raised legitimate concerns were dismissed or ignored. Standards that should have been maintained were allowed to erode. He paused, letting the words sink in. I take full responsibility for these failures. As your commander, I should have been more vigilant, more engaged, more willing to look beyond surface appearances to understand the reality of service at this installation. I was not. That ends today. Effective immediately, we are implementing new policies for complaint reporting, leadership accountability, and command climate assessment. We are establishing independent review processes for all formal complaints. We are requiring mandatory training for all officers and NCOs on proper leadership and treatment of subordinates. And we're making it clear that abuse of authority will not be tolerated at any level. The formation stood in silence, processing the unprecedented admission of institutional failure from their commander. Thatcher continued, "Some of you have suffered under toxic leadership. Some of you witnessed that suffering and felt powerless to stop it. Some of you may have participated in creating that toxic environment. Today marks a line. Behind that line is the culture we are leaving behind. Ahead of that line is the standard we will uphold going forward." He gestured to Keller. "This is Colonel Adrian Keller from Division G1. Some of you may recognize her from the past week when she was conducting an undercover assessment of our base operations. She experienced firsthand the kind of treatment that has been directed at our junior personnel. Her assessment has been instrumental in identifying the scope of our problems and charting a path toward correction." Keller stepped forward to the podium, her uniform now displaying the silver eagles of a full colonel. The same uniform she had carefully kept hidden for 9 days while enduring mockery and contempt. The formation rippled with movement as thousands of eyes focused on her, recognition spreading through the ranks as soldiers connected the quiet woman from Building 6 with the officer now standing before them. For the past week, I have had the opportunity to observe Fort Ashford from a unique perspective, Keller began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. I arrived as someone you were told to dismiss, someone presented as insignificant and temporary. And many of you did exactly that. You dismissed me. You mocked me. You treated me as if my presence was an inconvenience rather than an opportunity. She paused, letting the discomfort settle. But some of you did something different. Some of you treated me with basic respect despite having no reason to believe I deserved special consideration. Some of you offered help when it was not required. Some of you demonstrated the kind of leadership and character that should be standard in our military, not exceptional. In a crowd, Keller could see Specialist Reeves standing at attention, tears streaming down her face. To those soldiers, I want to say thank you. You maintained your standards even when the culture around you suggested those standards were optional. You proved that integrity is not conditional on audience or advantage. But to those who failed that test, who believed that someone powerless was someone unworthy of respect, I want you to understand something crucial. Every single day, you interact with soldiers who have less rank than you, less experience than you, less authority than you. And every single day, you make choices about how to treat those soldiers. The choices you made with me this past week are the same choices you make with them. The difference is they do not have the authority I do to demand accountability. The formation had gone absolutely still, the weight of her words pressing down like physical force. Keller continued, her tone firm but not harsh. Leadership is not about how you treat those who can affect your career. It is about how you treat everyone, regardless of whether they have power over you or not. It is about maintaining standards of respect and professionalism, not because you're being watched by someone important, but because it is the right way to serve. She gestured to where Cardwell and Halverson stood in the formation, both men at rigid attention, their faces carefully blank. 2 members of this command failed that test catastrophically. They created an environment where abuse was normalized, where complaints were suppressed, where junior personnel learned that speaking truth meant inviting retaliation. They are facing consequences for those failures. But they did not act in isolation. They were enabled by a culture that looked the other way, that prioritized appearance over substance, that allowed cruelty to masquerade as toughness. That culture ends now, Keller said, her voice rising slightly. Not because of this inspection, not because division is watching, but because you, every single one of you, will refuse to let it continue. When you see a leader treating subordinates with contempt, you will report it. When you witness violations of basic respect and dignity, you will speak up. When you're tempted to dismiss someone as unimportant because of their rank or position, you will remember this moment and choose differently. Colonel Thatcher returned to the podium. Thank you, Colonel Keller. He addressed the formation again. Effective immediately, Building 6 Administrative Section will be reorganized under new leadership. Specialist Diana Reeves has been selected to serve as acting section chief, while we identify permanent personnel. Her demonstrated courage in filing complaints despite facing retaliation exemplifies the kind of integrity we need in leadership positions. Gasps rippled through the formation. Reeves looked stunned, her eyes wide with shock. Beside her, other junior enlisted personnel were smiling, a visible wave of hope spreading through ranks that had become accustomed to cynicism. Additionally, Thatcher continued, we are establishing a Fort Ashford Leadership Council composed of personnel from all ranks. This council will meet monthly to discuss command climate concerns and recommend policy changes. Membership will rotate to ensure diverse perspectives and prevent entrenchment of power. The first meeting will occur next week, and I expect full participation and honest dialogue. Command Sergeant Major Desmond stepped forward. I want to speak directly to our junior enlisted personnel, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I failed you. I allowed myself to become disconnected from your daily reality. I assumed that silence meant satisfaction rather than suppression. That was wrong. I am committed to doing better, to being present, to listening when you speak and acting on what I hear. You have my word that complaints will be taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and resolved with transparency. The formation was dismissed, but personnel did not immediately disperse. Instead, small groups formed, soldiers talking in animated clusters, processing what had just occurred. Keller watched as several junior enlisted personnel approached Reeves, congratulating her, expressing relief, sharing stories they had kept hidden. The transformation was not complete, but it had begun. Hartford joined Keller as she stood observing the parade ground. That was well done, Colonel. Direct, but not cruel. Firm, but not punitive. You gave them accountability without humiliation. Cardwell and Halverson humiliated themselves, Keller replied. I simply documented what they freely chose to do when they believed no one important was watching. What happens to them now? Formal investigation, likely letters of reprimand at minimum, possible reduction in rank or separation depending on what else we uncover. Cardwell's career is effectively over. Halverson will retire without the honors he likely expected. And the base itself? That depends on whether the cultural change takes root or withers. Words are easy. Sustained transformation requires constant vigilance and leadership willing to hold themselves accountable first. Do you think Thatcher can provide that leadership? Keller considered the question. I think he was shocked enough by what we found to genuinely want change. Whether he has the strength to maintain that commitment when it becomes inconvenient remains to be seen. They walked together toward battalion headquarters, passing clusters of soldiers still processing the revelations. Several junior personnel spotted Keller and came to attention, saluting with a crispness that spoke of genuine respect rather than mere obligation. She returned each salute with equal precision, acknowledging them not as a colonel expecting deference, but as a fellow soldier recognizing their worth. Inside the headquarters building, General Morrison waited in Thatcher's office. He was a 3-star with iron gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of service in difficult places. He stood when Keller entered, extending his hand. Colonel Keller, your assessment exceeded expectations. We knew there were problems at Fort Ashford, but the depth and systemic nature of the failures was beyond what preliminary reports suggested. Thank you, sir, Keller replied. The assessment methodology proved effective in revealing authentic behavior patterns. Morrison smiled slightly. The methodology was risky. If word had leaked about your true identity before you were ready, the entire assessment could have been compromised. The risk was acceptable given the stakes, Keller said. Junior personnel were suffering under toxic leadership with no effective recourse. Conventional inspection methods would have revealed sanitized versions of reality. Experiencing the system as a powerless participant provided insights no standard assessment could match. The general nodded. Your recommendations for remediation are being implemented immediately. Additionally, Division is considering using similar assessment methodologies at other installations where command climate concerns have been raised. If this story of hidden rank and transformation moved you, drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment, or share if you have ever witnessed someone reveal unexpected authority or expertise in your own life. Morrison turned to Hartford. Colonel Hartford, I want a full report on my desk within 72 hours. Include recommendations not just for Fort Ashford, but for division-wide policy changes to prevent similar situations from developing elsewhere. Yes, sir, Hartford replied. The general looked at Keller once more. You took considerable personal risk conducting this assessment. Being subjected to abuse and disrespect, even temporarily, even knowingly, is not easy even for someone with your experience and rank. The temporary discomfort I experienced gave voice to soldiers who have lived with that reality every day with no end in sight, Keller replied. That made it worthwhile. Morrison saluted, a gesture of respect between equals. The military is better for having officers like you, Colonel Keller. Carry on. As evening fell over Fort Ashford, Keller returned one final time to Building 6. The office was empty now, computers dark, desks cleared. She stood in the doorway, remembering the past 9 days, the casual cruelty, the systematic dismissal, the assumption that powerlessness meant worthlessness. She remembered Specialist Reeves stumbling past her desk, remembered Torres and Volkov discussing her as if she were furniture, remembered Halverson's threats and Cardwell's contempt. But she also remembered the junior soldier who had held the door for her without being asked, remembered the mess hall worker who had smiled and asked if she needed anything, remembered every small act of decency from personnel who maintained their integrity despite the toxic environment around them. Those were the soldiers worth fighting for. Those were the standards worth defending. And those were the reasons she had spent 9 days being treated like she did not matter, so that everyone who actually did not have the power to demand better would finally be seen, heard, and protected by a system that was supposed to serve them. She turned off the light and closed the door, leaving Building 6 behind, but carrying forward the lessons it had taught about leadership, respect, and the fundamental truth that how you treat the powerless reveals everything about your character.